The truck came up County Road 17 just after sunrise, dragging a pale ribbon of dust behind it, beneath a November sky the color of old galvanized steel. Emma Carter heard it before she saw it. She was standing on a ladder beside the abandoned dairy barn, one hand pressed against a sheet of patched tin, while the other worked a screw into a warped roof beam. The battery drill slowed halfway through. She released the trigger, waited, tried again. Nothing. Emma looked down at the dead drill, then toward the farmhouse. There was no spare battery. The other one had stopped holding a charge sometime in September. She climbed down, found a rusted brazen bit in her father's workshop, and went back up. By then, the truck was turning through the gate. 500 laying hens had arrived. The driver eased past a fence post, held upright with baling wire, and stopped beside a tractor that had been sitting on blocks for 3 weeks. Its left rear wheel was missing. A blue tarp covered the exposed axle, though one corner had torn loose and snapped in the wind. Across the yard, the old grain bin stood open and hollow. 3 kernels of corn lay near the auger boot, where mice had dragged them out. Emma wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward the truck. The rear doors opened. Sound poured into the morning. Claws scraped plastic. Wings struck wire. Hundreds of young hens shifted inside stacked transport crates, nervous from the road and from one another, filling the cold air with a restless, rising murmur. Emma stood there for a moment with her jaw set against the wind. Then she lifted the first crate. The birds felt heavier than they had when she had calculated their weight on paper. She carried them into the old dairy barn. The place still smelled faintly of dust, old timber, and cattle, though no cow had stood there in years. She had spent the previous 3 weeks turning the abandoned building into something that might keep birds alive through a Missouri winter. Nest boxes, made from salvaged plywood, lined one wall. Feeders hung from chains that had once held milking equipment. The broken windows on the north side were boarded over, while the south-facing glass had been scrubbed until weak winter sunlight could reach the floor. Underfoot lay nearly a foot of straw, wood shavings, and chopped leaves. To anyone driving past, it looked less like a poultry house than a tired barn stuffed with bedding. The second crate went in, then the third. By the time Emma had unloaded 100 birds, a pickup slowed on the county road. The driver did not stop. He only turned his head. Another truck passed 20 minutes later, slower than the first. Near noon, a red Ford rolled almost to a crawl beside the mailbox. 2 men sat inside. Emma could see their faces angled toward the barn. She kept carrying crates. Her arms began to shake by the 4th stack. She changed her grip and kept going. At 3 in the afternoon, the final hens disappeared through the barn door. Emma stood in the middle aisle while 500 birds explored their new home, scratching at clean bedding and jostling around the waterers. The sound filled every corner of the building. Outside, the November light was already thinning. She stepped into the yard and looked toward the farmhouse. The gutter over the kitchen sagged at one end. White paint curled from the window frames in narrow strips. Beside the porch, a 5-gallon bucket caught water from a leak that her father had meant to repair the previous spring. On the kitchen table sat an envelope from First County Bank. Emma had opened it so many times that the fold had gone soft. She knew every number printed inside, the amount overdue, the interest, the date. She also knew how much remained in the farm checking account after buying the hens. Not enough to repair the tractor. Not enough to buy fertilizer for 68 acres. Not enough to survive many mistakes. She shut the barn door. By sunset, almost every dollar she could move without missing a bank payment had feathers on it. The Carter place had once looked different. Emma remembered that, though there were fewer signs of it every year. When she was 8, her grandfather Walter had kept milk cows in the barn. In winter, steam had rolled from their backs when the doors opened at dawn. The concrete floor had always been wet somewhere, and the stainless steel pipeline hummed above her head while Walter moved from animal to animal in a cap that smelled of hay. Later, when dairy prices fell, Emma's father shifted the farm toward corn, hay, and a few beef cattle. The cows disappeared. The pipeline came down. The milk room became storage. Then the storage room became a place where broken things waited because there was never enough money to repair them. A hydraulic hose, 2 cracked planter plates, a carburetor, a box of fence staples gone orange with rust. By the time Emma was 21, her father's lungs had begun failing. At first, Caleb Carter worked around the sickness. He coughed into his sleeve while greasing the tractor. He rested longer between hay bales. He kept an oxygen bottle near the mudroom door, but left it behind whenever he crossed the yard, as if refusing to carry it might keep the illness from becoming real. One afternoon, Emma found him sitting on the tractor step halfway through planting. The engine was still running. His hands hung between his knees. For the first time in her life, her father looked smaller than the machine. After that, more of the farm passed quietly into Emma's hands. She planted. She sprayed. She repaired fence after storms. She drove her father to appointments in town and came home to finish chores under headlights. When Caleb died in July, the farm did not stop long enough to mourn with her. The pasture kept growing. A water trough cracked. Property taxes came due. The tractor blew a hydraulic seal. The west cornfield curled under a week of dry wind, its leaves rolling tight against the heat. At the funeral, casseroles filled the kitchen. 2 weeks later, the refrigerator was nearly empty again, and Emma was sitting at the same table with her father's notebook spread in front of her. That was when she discovered how close the farm was to being lost. There were debts she knew about. There were also debts her father had hidden from everyone except the bank. Equipment repairs charged during the final season. A refinanced operating note. A line of credit stretched across 2 poor harvests. Emma spent an entire evening moving figures from one sheet of paper to another. When she finished, she walked outside. The yard was dark. The barn roof clicked as it cooled. Fireflies moved above the drainage ditch. She stood beside the mailbox and looked at the 68 acres her family had pieced together over 3 generations. Then she went back inside and began crossing out everything she could sell. An old hay rake, 2 unused gates, scrap steel, a small stock trailer. None of it was enough. Selling land would have been enough. Everyone knew that. 20 acres from the north side could have cleared the immediate pressure. A neighbor had already hinted that he would buy them. Another farmer had asked about renting the bottom ground. Emma never returned either call. The north field held the oldest part of the farm. Her grandfather had paid for it in pieces, 1 hard year at a time. Her father had rebuilt the terrace there after the flood of 1993. Near the hedge line stood an oak with a strip of barbed wire swallowed deep inside its trunk. Selling that field would solve a financial problem. It would also turn the Carter farm into something smaller forever. So Emma searched for another answer. She found it in a dented metal box above the refrigerator. Inside were notebooks going back almost 40 years. Walter Carter had written down everything. Rainfall totals, feed prices, milk production, calving dates, frost, corn yields, how long a tractor belt lasted before snapping. Most entries were plain numbers with no explanation. But winter after winter, another pattern appeared. Eggs. Walter had kept laying hens during the dairy years, never enough to call them the main business. Yet his records showed exactly when they earned the most. Cold months. Storm months. Weeks when icy roads delayed delivery trucks. Weeks when the small stores in town paid more because they could not keep eggs on the shelf. Emma began reading every entry connected to poultry. Her grandfather had written about keeping bedding deep and dry, letting lower layers slowly compost and release a small amount of heat. He had recorded when short daylight reduced laying. He had noted how hens ate more when temperatures dropped, and how much production improved when light remained consistent. Then Emma found something newer: her father's handwriting. Caleb had apparently considered bringing hens back to the farm years before his illness worsened. Several pages contained rough calculations for 500 birds. Feed consumption, mortality, cartons, lighting, local prices. The numbers stopped halfway down one page. At the bottom, her father had underlined a brief observation about winter shortages and quick cash flow. Emma did not read it as a message from the dead. She read it as unfinished work. For the next 2 weeks, she drove into town at odd hours. She watched the grocery delivery schedule. She noted which restaurants bought the most eggs. She looked through old weather records. She compared winter retail prices with summer prices and calculated what 500 hens might produce if the flock performed badly rather than well. She assumed feed would cost more than expected. She assumed some birds would die. She assumed egg production would fall during cold weather. Only after trying to make the idea fail on paper did she allow herself to believe it might work. Then a pullet grower 2 counties west needed to clear space before winter. 500 young hens, near laying age, priced below what Emma had expected. She wrote the check. By the following afternoon, half the town seemed to know. At the feed store, men who had farmed beside her father watched her stack layer ration into the pickup. At the diner, her name moved from table to table with the coffee pot. People saw what she had spent. They saw the broken tractor. They saw the December bank deadline getting closer. What they did not see were the columns in Walter Carter's notebook. Emma did not show them. She went home and worked. The first month nearly broke the plan. The hens did not begin laying on Emma's schedule. Some were stressed from the move. Others crowded the nest boxes. A few became sick. One died in the second week, then another. Egg counts rose slowly. 73, 86, 104. On paper, 500 birds sounded enormous. In a wire basket at the end of a 16-hour day, 104 eggs looked painfully small. Emma wrote the number down. The next morning, she started again. She learned which corner of the barn stayed damp after rain. She moved a feeder because dominant birds were blocking smaller ones. She added oyster shell. She changed the ventilation along the south wall after condensation appeared under the roof. She hauled spoiled pumpkins from a farm stand and split them open with a flat shovel. The hens reduced each orange half to a thin shell within minutes. She began fermenting part of their grain ration in clean buckets, watching temperature and smell carefully so she did not trade one problem for another. At 4 each morning, light came on inside the barn before anything else on the farm. From the county road, it looked like a yellow square floating in darkness. Inside, Emma moved between the birds while frost silvered the fields. She checked water, gathered eggs, refilled feeders, changed bedding where moisture collected. The tasks repeated, but the mornings never felt quite the same. Some began with the soft, steady sound of hens feeding. Others began with a frozen nipple line, a sick bird tucked beneath a nest box, or a raccoon track in the mud outside the door. One December morning, Emma turned a faucet and nothing came out. The water line beneath the barn had frozen solid. She crawled under the building before daylight with a flashlight clenched between her teeth, frozen soil pressed against her elbows. Spiderwebs dragged across her hair. She worked a heat cable along the pipe a few inches at a time until circulation finally returned. When she climbed out, her jacket was soaked through at the shoulders. There was ice in her hair. She still had eggs to collect. Later that week, freezing rain loosened a section of tin above the north corner. Emma heard it banging from the house. She climbed onto the roof with a wrench and a replacement sheet, while wind pushed hard enough to make the ladder tremble beneath her boots. Her fingers went numb inside wet gloves. Twice she flattened herself against the roof when gusts hit. She finished after dark. The next morning, egg production reached 168. A week later, 213. Then 274. The increase should have felt like victory. Instead, the bank statement arrived. Emma left it unopened until evening. When she finally sat at the kitchen table, sleet was striking the roof in dry little bursts. She placed her egg records beside the bank notice. Feed costs had climbed. Electricity was higher than expected. The tractor still needed a tire. The flock was improving, but the numbers had not yet produced enough cash to make the bank disappear. Emma sat there with both hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Through the kitchen window, the poultry barn glowed across the yard. For several minutes she imagined another future. A sold field. A smaller farm. No bank letters for a while. Maybe relief. Her eyes moved to the dark outline of the north pasture. She remembered her father rebuilding fence there after a summer storm, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. She remembered Walter carrying her on his shoulders through knee-high grass. She remembered Caleb sitting on the tractor step, too sick to continue and too stubborn to admit it. Emma folded the bank letter once. Then again. She put it back in the envelope. Before dawn the next morning, she was in the barn, adjusting the lighting timer. By Christmas, the hens were producing enough that the diner began buying every week. The grocery store took several cases. A church breakfast bought more. Emma washed cartons at the kitchen sink, penciled dates onto labels, and stacked eggs in an old refrigerator in the mudroom. Cash began entering the farm in small amounts. $30. 70. 110. Money that did not require waiting until harvest. Money that arrived every few days. Emma fed most of it back into the flock. She bought grain before prices climbed again. She replaced a failing breaker. She kept the bank payment envelope empty on top of the refrigerator. Then January changed everything. The weather radio began warning about the storm 3 days before it arrived. A mass of Arctic air was moving south across the plains, colliding with wet weather pushing north. Forecasts changed every few hours, each one worse than the last. First freezing rain, then heavy snow, then temperatures below zero. Emma drove to town before the roads turned. Feed store shelves were already thinning. She bought what grain she could afford, 2 spare water heaters, a roll of electrical wire, and another box of fuses. When she returned, the wind had shifted north. It smelled metallic and raw. She carried every sack of feed inside, filled barrels with water, charged the truck battery, stacked split firewood on the porch. Checked the barn roof twice. By dusk, rain began ticking against the windows. At midnight, it turned to ice. Emma woke to darkness. The power had failed. For several seconds, she lay still, listening. The farmhouse had no refrigerator hum, no heater fan, no light beneath the bedroom door. Then she heard it. Wind. It pressed against the house in long, low surges, making the siding creak. Emma pulled on jeans over long underwear, shoved her feet into boots, grabbed a flashlight, and crossed the yard. Freezing rain struck her face like sand. The ground had become glass. She slipped before reaching the barn, caught herself on one hand, and tore skin from her palm. Inside, 500 hens shifted in the dark. The automatic water system was dead. So were the lights that had kept their winter laying cycle stable. Emma checked the breaker. Nothing. The outage was upstream. She dragged a portable generator from the workshop. It had not run since the previous spring. The pull cord resisted. Again. Again. On the 5th attempt, the engine coughed once and died. Emma removed the side cover with hands already stiff from cold. The carburetor bowl held old fuel. She drained it onto frozen ground, cleaned the plug beneath the beam of her flashlight, and tried again. The engine caught. For 10 seconds, then stopped. Snow had begun mixing with the ice. Emma could hear it hissing against the barn roof. She tried again. The generator finally settled into a rough mechanical roar. She ran one line to the water heaters and another to a few lights. Not enough for everything, enough for survival. By 3 in the morning, the temperature had fallen sharply. Water froze along the edges of buckets, almost as soon as Emma filled them. She carried warm water from the house in 2 5-gallon pails because the barn line had begun to ice. Each trip crossed 40 yards of open yard. By the 4th trip, snow had covered the glaze beneath it. Her boots slid. Both buckets dropped. Water exploded across the ground and froze in a spreading black sheet. Emma hit her knee hard enough to make her vision flash white. She stayed down for several seconds. The wind pushed snow across her jacket. Her left hand throbbed where the skin had torn earlier. The barn lights glowed 20 yards away. Emma forced herself upright. She retrieved the buckets, filled them again. At dawn, the county road vanished beneath blowing snow. Telephone service became intermittent. A branch broke somewhere behind the farmhouse with a sound like a rifle shot. The generator sputtered. Emma ran outside. The fuel line had begun icing. She shielded it with her body while she worked. The wind found every opening in her clothes. Snow worked down the back of her collar. Her fingers became clumsy enough that she dropped the wrench twice. Inside the barn, the hens crowded together. Cold alone did not terrify Emma. Moisture did. A sealed barn would hold humidity, and humid cold could turn frostbite and respiratory stress into a flock-wide disaster. Too much ventilation, though, would put the birds in a direct draft, so she worked the vents by inches, opened one, closed another, watched condensation, checked cones, added dry litter, carried more water, collected eggs before they froze. The storm continued, all day, all night. On the second morning, Emma realized she had not slept more than 40 minutes at a time. Her knee had swollen. 2 fingernails were split. Her right shoulder burned whenever she lifted a bucket. She found one hen dead beneath the roost, then another. For a few seconds, Emma simply stood over them. The barn was filled with the scratch of claws and the drone of the generator. Outside, the wind was screaming. She carried the dead birds out, then went back to work. By afternoon, fuel was running low. The tractor tank held diesel, useless for the gasoline generator. The nearest gas station was 7 miles away, and the county road had not been plowed. Emma shut off every electrical load she could sacrifice. The farmhouse went completely cold. She moved into the barn. She wrapped herself in her father's old insulated coveralls and slept sitting against a feed bin for 20 minutes at a time, waking whenever the generator changed pitch. Near midnight, it did. The engine coughed. Emma's eyes opened instantly. Another cough, then silence. Darkness swallowed the barn. For half a second, nothing moved. Then the hens began stirring. Emma stumbled outside with the flashlight. Snow reached above her ankles, hard and wind-packed. She removed the generator cover and found ice around the air intake. Her hands would barely close. She stripped off one glove and worked bare-fingered because she could no longer feel the small parts through fabric. Metal burned against her skin. She cleared the ice, pulled the cord. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The wind shoved her sideways. She pulled again. The engine coughed once. Emma pulled until pain climbed from her shoulder into her neck. Again. Again. The generator caught. Its roar seemed impossibly loud in the storm. Emma bent over it, breathing hard, forehead almost touching the metal cover. Then the lights inside the barn flickered back on. By the 3rd day, road deliveries into town had nearly stopped. The grocery store sold the last commercial eggs shortly after opening. The diner had less than a day's supply. Several larger poultry operations in the region were struggling with the same cold, transport delays, and power problems. Emma knew none of this. She had stopped checking her phone because the battery needed to be conserved. Her world had narrowed to the barn. Water, feed, air, light. Eggs. The numbers had fallen. 306, 289, then 317. Emma stared at that last count for a long time. 317 eggs after 3 days of a storm that had nearly broken the farm. She put them into cartons. On the fourth morning, the snow finally weakened. A four-wheel drive pickup appeared at the gate. It moved slowly through the drifts and stopped beside the barn. Ruth, the owner of the diner, climbed down in heavy boots. She looked at the generator, at the fuel cans, at Emma's swollen knee, at the bloody tape wrapped around 2 fingers. Then she looked through the open barn door at case after case of eggs stacked inside. For months, Emma had listened while people explained why the hens would ruin her. She had never answered. Ruth looked back toward the road, where another pickup was already turning through the gate. Then came the only sentence Emma needed to hear. "Looks like those hens just saved the Carter farm." Emma did not smile immediately. She was too tired, but something in her face changed. By noon, the first cases were gone. By evening, the grocery had taken more. A cafe in the next town sent a 4-wheel drive truck for 10 dozen. Families began calling as phone service returned. Some offered almost any price. Emma did not take advantage of them. She raised her price enough to cover the winter cost and reflect the shortage, but she refused the wildest offers and divided what she had among regular customers. The strange thing was how quickly the farm's rhythm changed. For years, Carter Farm had spent money for months before seeing any return. Seed in spring, fuel, fertilizer, repairs. Then a single harvest decided whether the year had worked. Eggs were different. A carton left in the morning. Cash returned that afternoon. Another carton left the next day. More cash. Small amounts but steady. During the worst 2 weeks of the shortage, the old mudroom refrigerator was almost never full for more than an hour. Emma began placing money into the bank envelope above the refrigerator. At first, a few 20s. Then hundreds. Then enough that she stopped counting every night because counting made her nervous. Late in January, she drove to First County Bank. The snow along Main Street had turned gray from salt and traffic. Emma walked inside wearing the same work coat she had worn during the storm. She placed the overdue payment on the counter. The banker looked at the amount, then at her. His expression changed, but Emma did not wait for it. She took the receipt and went home. The farm was not debt-free, not even close, but foreclosure was no longer approaching like a date circled in red. February brought more cold. The hens kept laying. Not perfectly. Some days production dropped, feed remained expensive, several birds died over the winter, one electrical circuit burned out and had to be replaced. Nothing became easy just because the plan had worked. That was the part no one saw from the county road. They saw customers. They saw egg cartons. They saw Emma buying feed without asking for credit. They did not see her asleep in a chair at the kitchen table with a pencil still in her hand. They did not see the bruises on her knee fading from purple to yellow. They did not see her warming stiff fingers over the truck heater before carrying another load of water. Success looked cleaner from a distance. Spring exposed what winter had built. All season, Emma had added straw and wood shavings to the barn floor, keeping the upper surface dry while older material slowly decomposed underneath. When temperatures warmed, she began removing the deepest layers. What came out was no longer recognizable as bedding. It was dark, dense, warm in the center. She piled it behind the barn and let it finish composting. Weeks later, she spread the material over a narrow strip of exhausted ground near the lower pasture. Rain came. On untreated soil, water pooled briefly and moved downhill. On the composted strip, it darkened the surface and disappeared. By early summer, grass there stood thicker. Emma pushed a spade into the soil. The blade entered farther than it had the previous year. She lifted a clod. A worm twisted between the roots. Emma crouched for a moment, holding the soil in both hands. That tiny movement mattered more to her than the newspaper clipping Ruth later taped beside the diner register. The chickens had bought the farm time. Their manure was beginning to give something back to the land itself. The county agent returned in April. This time he stayed most of the afternoon. He inspected the barn, measured the litter depth, looked through Emma's production records, walked the compost pile, studied the pasture test strip. Word spread differently now. Trucks still slowed near Carter Farm, but drivers sometimes turned in. Farmers wanted to see the lighting timer. They wanted to know how much feed 500 birds consumed. They asked about winter water, bedding, mortality, egg buyers, manure. Emma showed them what she could. She never reminded anyone what they had thought in November. She did not need to. By July, fresh paint covered the worst boards on the barn. A new tire stood on the repaired tractor. The farmhouse gutter no longer sagged. The farm still carried debt. The equipment was still old. Fence posts still needed replacing. But the place no longer looked as though every broken thing had been waiting years for attention. There was movement again. Repair. Use. Purpose. The diner continued buying Carter Farm eggs after prices returned to normal. So did the grocery. Emma set an old refrigerator beneath a covered stand near the road and added a simple payment box for regular customers. She planted pumpkins on a small patch of ground, partly for sale and partly for winter feed. She began mapping where future compost applications would go. Her notebooks grew thicker. Rainfall, feed, egg production, soil observations, costs, mistakes. She wrote them down exactly as Walter had. Nearly 1 year after the hens arrived, Emma walked to the end of the driveway carrying a paint can and brush. The farm sign beside the mailbox had been there since before she was born. Weather had bleached the letters until Carter Farm was barely visible. She removed it from the posts, sanded the wood, primed it, then painted the name again in slow black strokes. Behind her, hens scratched beneath the autumn grass. A repaired tractor sat near the equipment shed. The dairy barn that had once looked ready to collapse caught the late sunlight on a strip of new metal roofing. Across the lower ground, the pasture held green where the soil had once looked exhausted. Emma finished the final letter and stepped back. A year earlier, she had stood in almost the same place, watching strangers slow down to see how badly she was about to fail. Now some stopped for eggs. Some came to study the barn. Some came because they wanted to know whether an old idea might work on their own farm. Emma never told them that she had nearly sold 20 acres on a sleet-covered December night. She never explained how frightening the first egg counts had been, or how the generator cord had cut into her hand while the storm tried to freeze 500 birds in the dark. She did not tell them how often she had wondered whether everyone else had been right. What they called one lucky winter had been hundreds of choices made when none of them looked important. A repaired vent, a bucket of fermented grain, a line in an old notebook, a water pipe thawed before sunrise. One more trip across an icy yard, one more hour awake, one more day without selling the land. The 500 hens never made Emma Carter rich. What they bought was more valuable. They bought her time before the bank could take the farm. They bought fertility for tired soil. They bought enough breathing room for another season. And they allowed a name that had nearly faded from a weathered sign to remain where it had been for 3 generations. That winter, people around town said eggs had become worth their weight in gold. Emma knew better. Gold could have paid a debt. Those hens had done something harder. They had kept the Carter name on the land.